Welcome, Dr. Patterson.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for agreeing to participate in our event. So far, we have heard from the other panelists about the physical manifestation of aging.
Mm-hmm.
And what I would love to hear from you is what happens psychologically to women.
I'd love to. I want to go back to the roots of the kinds of intelligence that I think we bring to our lives as mature women. And I think the roots of that, part of the roots of that are, of course, in the education we share with our brothers and, you know, the society we live in. But a part of the roots of that lie in the mothering experience. And by mothering, I mean taking care of living things, especially taking care of people who are smaller, but also of, I think, living things that are precious to us. So the mother work, the care work, extends outward. But when we're young women, we learn about taking care of children. And say, even if we don't have our own, most of us come through a kind of apprenticeship at the hands of our moms and our aunts and our neighbors in taking care of children. So in our culture, going back to motherhood, raising children is not a communal endeavor, right? And this is how we differ from other cultures and the cultures that you've studied. Mm-hmm. It is not it's not even necessarily a family endeavor. We talk about families raising children, but really children are ultimately the responsibility of their mothers. And when their mothers can't take care of them, babysitters do, and they're almost always female. Almost all daycare workers are female, right? So this is the world of the women with the strollers, right? And as a society, we've made decisions to really draw thick lines between the world of the women and the strollers and, say, the world of academia, where real knowledge happens. I've been looking through my career at the big and small practical decisions of mothers in their lives. And I have found that the thinking we bring to these decisions runs really, really deep. By working through things like, do I use daycare? Do I go back to work? Do I leave my husband? Do I have a right to my sexuality while I'm raising children? Do I homeschool, right? In making these decisions, we have had to redefine for ourselves what it means to be a loving, caring, and responsible human being in a world where what we know, what they don't know. And what they don't know is that there are people in the world who are tiny, people who are sick, people who are old, disabled. We're not all on equal footing. There was just no way to skirt this question of how do we be responsible, loving people in this world, because there were no socially given acceptable answers that actually worked. There are 6 distinct and unique skills of thinking that come out of the decision to care and to try to have integrity about it and about how we live in the world. The first 3 are what Sarah Ruddick, the maternal philosopher, calls the maternal imperatives. You have to keep the baby alive. You have to see the child clearly, mm-hmm. as they really are, and you have to shape that child for their future in society. Right? These are the 3 maternal imperatives. So first, preserving what is precious and living, right? And we have to keep the baby alive. We tend to take this for granted in our culture because, you know, most of us don't quote Roseanne Barr when she said, if it's 10 o'clock and the kids are not dead, I've done my job. I always love that. I think it's, I love that. To ignore this accomplishment of keeping kids alive is an incredibly privileged thing to do. Mm-hmm. That we don't have to worry about this, or we think we don't have to. But through most of history and in much of the world today, there are so many threats to the survival of children. Keeping them healthy and keeping the home together takes a huge amount of energy and resourcefulness. And that is true for Canadian mothers too. Mm-hmm. And we don't talk about it for different reasons. We don't talk about it because, as I said, we're not taking a communal responsibility for that. And if we're not taking a communal responsibility for that, what works is to pretend that it's easy, even when it's not. Right? So, and if it's hard for us, and I'm here to tell you it is. I have been a mother in poverty, and it was hard. It was really hard. And I cannot imagine doing the same thing today in Somalia or in Libya or in Russia, in Kenya. It's no job for the stupid or the faint of heart. The second thing is to wonder and appreciate the child. We have to see the child as they are and not as we wish they could be and not as an extension of ourselves. Right. And every mother knows how difficult this is.
Very difficult.
So we have to wonder, both in the sense of asking questions and also in the sense of being amazed. Wow, that's really different than me. That's really cool, right? When we're amazed by our children, only when we're willing to be amazed by them can we really provide what they need to become themselves. The third is to shape the future. This shaping and training of children, it's almost the opposite of wonder, but it's also ours to do. Right? At least sometimes we think it's the opposite of wonder because it involves discipline. It involves, saying you've got to comb the back of your hair too, right? And so we have to consider the world as it is and also the world that we hope for. And we have to prepare our children to find a place in both. And doing this means really getting acquainted with our own values and morals and practicing them with the knowledge that our children are watching us. So it involves struggling with issues of discipline and also issues of who we are. The next three have to do with who our circle of care enfolds. Who do we care for? How do we care for them, and why? Right? And these, I think, come to me more from the work of Carol Gilligan. So the number 4 is to balance the needs and entitlements and responsibilities of people of unequal power and resources. And I mentioned before that we live in a world where people aren't equal. Most ethical systems and all of classical Enlightenment philosophy refers to a society of equals. But mothers have to do diplomacy between siblings who aren't equal. They have to do diplomacy between children and adults. We have to think about needs versus entitlements, wants, who's vulnerable to exploitation, who needs coaching and empathy. We have to, and that's a much more complicated way of thinking. And fifth, very importantly, we have to put ourselves into the circle. And I made this a separate point. Because it's so hard for us sometimes. Some of us don't accomplish this until we're middle-aged or older. But sooner or later, most of us learn that if we don't take our own needs as seriously as we take our children's needs, the whole family, the whole system can fall apart. In learning to have empathy for our own needs, we deepen what we can feel for others. Right? And we become more honest about what we can and cannot give. Finally, we determine the boundaries of who is family. We have to think about what is precious to us. Who are our relations? How do we keep from burning out as we extend the limits of our hearts to include the children of other mothers and the children of the future? Because if we can't do this, then I don't think we can change the world. But if we do this, without limits, will burn out. So all of these ways of thinking come about because we have followed what I call the maternal imperative. And the maternal imperative is you love what is in front of you and you do what love requires. The big danger here is self-sacrifice, right? Because being selfless, on the one hand, being selfless was once we were told that this is the proper thing women to do, it's a high praise to be called selfless. On the other hand, it's disdained as a sucker's place in life. So it's been a really confusing and demanding time to be women. We are definitely a generation that has had to make our own way and make it up as we go along. Our mothers lived very differently than us, and our children take a lot of things for granted that we did not, My kids can't believe I wasn't allowed to take shop in school. Why didn't you take metalwork, Mom?
Wow.
Wasn't allowed.
I find all of this terribly fascinating because as I am in my early 50s, I'm now wondering, so how does that translate into the next 50 years of my life?
So now we're 50-ish, and the kids leave home or don't.
Maybe,
Right?
yes.
And we get some breathing space to look back at what we know. And we know a lot. We're in a position to bring the skills and the knowledge base and the wisdom that we've gained in loving what was in front of us and doing what was required to a wider world. What I mean here is simply being open to love,
Right.
and to not turning away from what that love requires of us when it's in front of us,
Right.
right? When we're moved by something. Whether it is a picture of someone on the other side of the world that makes us go, I get it, I want to help.
So you're not reinventing the wheel.
No. And
You're just applying the
yeah.
principles we've already learned
yeah,
to a new, within a new context.
within a new context. So if that is joining hands with the grannies,
Excellent.
then it's because we are moved by love to do so.
Right.
And if that is protecting the salmon that swim in the creek in my backyard, right? It's because I am moved by love to do that, right? And so it's about being open to love and to not turning away from what that love requires of us. This pushes us to become smarter and wiser, and it's going to allow all this growing and learning to feel like play. It's not a sacrifice of the self, it's an enlargement of the self.
I think it's fabulous.
And we're ready to do it. It's a
do
good
you-
way to live.
Well, is there a real life example that you could use to explain what this love-inspired intelligence, something that you could share with us so that we could understand it maybe in a more concrete way?
Yeah, I do. I've been working on a paper about Rachel Carson. Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, and it was a call to arms on the use of pesticides, the indiscriminate use of pesticides in farming and in control of mosquitoes. And when I say that Carson's book was a call to arms, it was also meticulously researched and beautifully written. Her works are just so eloquent. They're wonderful to read even now. So she's a wonderful example of this way to live. And I want to tell you a little bit. She was never a biological mother.
Right.
According to her biographer, Rachel planned her life very purposely to avoid being a mother. Because she knew, in the first part of the 20th century, that being a mother was death to careers. But she was schooled by her mother in wonder. They were naturalists together in the hills of Philadelphia as Rachel was growing up. Yes. And Rachel spent an otherwise lonely childhood with the woodland creatures and the birds as her friends, right? So as a young adult, she turned that appreciative and amazed way of seeing to studying the ocean. And she loved the ocean as passionately as other people her age love their husbands and children. I'm sure of it. But her advanced education, which she really, really deserved. She had all the talent and she worked very, very hard, but she cut it short when her father died and her sister died. And she and her mother assumed the care of her sister's 2 children.
My goodness.
Yeah, so she was the provider. Her mother was the homemaker. And she went out, she took a job with the Fish and Wildlife Service, the United States Fish and Wildlife Service. She held that job for 15 years, and she wrote about ecologies, natural ecologies in the United States in these pamphlets. When she left this job to write full-time, she was in middle age. She wanted to write about the sea for a popular audience, and her second book, The Sea Around Us, was her breakthrough. It met with huge commercial success. It won her many book awards, and she became famous. And this was 1952. So, in 1952, Rachel's love for the sea was still, I think, more passionate than protective. But then, several things happened that changed this. One was her beloved niece, who she'd helped to raise, had a child out of wedlock. And in 1952, this was so scandalous that it not only would ruin the niece's future, but Rachel was very much afraid that the public would find out and that it would reflect badly on her. Right? Nevertheless, Rachel and her mother supported and cared for the niece and her child. And Rachel, who had lived with her mother throughout her adult life, cared for her mother, Marie, as she became more and more frail. Right? So this, too, like the caring for Roger, the grandnephew,
Right.
a lot of people criticized Rachel. A lot of people very close to her criticized her for taking care of Marie because it took so much of her writing time. Finally, the mother and the niece died within a short period. And Rachel suddenly became the full-time caregiver of Roger, the baby, who was now 6 years old in 1958. And she legally adopted him. She loved Roger dearly, and he inspired in her a desire to write a book for mothers on how to develop their children's ability to see and wonder in nature the way she had as a child. She really wanted to write that book. Unfortunately, she never got to. I know. It's been published posthumously. She left the manuscript. She found little Roger to be very, very time-consuming, and she struggled mightily to write. And he was grieving. He was just crushed by his mother's death. He was often ill. He was, as she said to her friend Dorothy, he was as lively as 17 crickets, leading some to wonder whether he had ADHD. And I think that maybe it was all this familiarity with death that influenced Rachel to answer the letter of her friend who wrote her about the death of songbirds from the spring of DDT.
Right.
Right. Rachel, who now has experienced death close up and she's mothering a child of the future, can't turn away from writing the book on pesticides. Right. She tries to turn away from it. It's a distraction from what she most wanted to be doing then, but she took it up. And completing the work of Silent Spring became a testament to her own endurance. She had breast cancer, and it came back for the second time while she was writing Silent Spring. And she completed the work under a tremendous burden of pain. By the time she was being interviewed after her book was published, she was in a wheelchair, but she would leave the wheelchair long enough to do speaking engagements and then go back to it. She testified in congressional hearings in 1964 that led to the banning of DDT in the United States. And she really effectively ended America's uncritical love affair with chemicals. And she's credited, and I think rightly so, with founding the modern environmentalist movement. Right? So here's a woman who changed the world. Her decision to preserve what is precious and to defend it as well as to appreciate its beauty. If she had been the kind of woman who would turn away from the care of her mother or turn away from Roger, she would not have been the woman to spend the final stage of her life writing Silent Spring. She wrote Silent Spring not in spite of her maternal thinking, but because of it.
Right.
Out of it came Silent Spring. Laura, I'd like to wrap this up if I can with a poem.
Okay.
And this is a poem by Charlotte Tall Mountain, and it's called For the Love of the World. It's for the love of a tree, she went out on a limb. For the love of the sea, she rocked the boat. For the love of the earth, she dug deeper. For the love of community, she mended fences. For the love of the stars, she let her light shine. For the love of spirit, she nurtured her soul. For the love of a good time, she sowed seeds of happiness. For the love of the goddess, she drew down the moon. For the love of nature, she made compost. For the love of a good meal, she gave thanks. For the love of family, she reconciled differences. For the love of creativity, she entertained new possibilities. For the love of her enemies, she suspended judgment. For the love of herself, she acknowledged her worth. And the world was richer for her.
Thank you, Dr. Serena Patterson.